Welcome back, everybody. This is the second and already final class of the goddess Isis. But a lot of the themes that we will be discussing tonight, or tomorrow morning, depending on where you are in the world, or I guess this morning, I will be covering in other classes this year. So we left off with one of the earliest of the hieroglyphic sources that really give us the outline of the so-called Osiris myth. And I will also take you through the major events of that myth as preserved in the mid-2nd century CE, writing by Plutarch about Osiris and Isis. But in this stela, now in the Louvre, the chief of the flocks of Amun, there were actual uh, goose geese flocks that were part of the temple economy of Amun in Karnak. And he describes, in a totally separate context, in a funerary context, the Osiris narrative myth. His sister, this is Isis, protects him, the rebels being driven away by means of the effective spells, the Ahu of her mouth. She is skilled of tongue, her words do not go astray. She who is effective with verbal commands, Isis, the magically efficacious one who protects her brother. And so this concept of effective spells of Ahu is actually a root that we see a lot in the vocabulary of magic. So the Achet horizon, which we talked about a lot in terms of this image of BAB, where the A in the center is something solar. The Achet horizon is a place of light and where the sun shows his efficacy and power. So Ach means both to be effective or powerful and to be luminous. And Ahu in the context of magic can be spells, but effective spells. And like Heka or magic, Ahu spells can affect positive change and transformation. And it does so probably in part by capturing the power of the cosmos. We know that Heka magic, for example, was something that the creator god gave to mankind in order to ward off bad events. So magic and spells in Egypt is tapping into the power of the cosmos. And Isis, chief among goddesses, taps into that very same magical power. And that's what we're going to be beginning with in tonight's class is Isis as this goddess great of magic, not simply using it for individual purposes, but also on the scale of the universe. Oh, great question about whether Heka is related to Hecate. It really sounds like it should be, but it's actually not etymologically. Hecate as a Greek name is not related to the ancient Egyptian word Heka for magic, but it's a good way to remember the word Heka for magic, even though there's no connection between them. And even in the Greco-Roman world, they don't make a connection between that goddess and the ancient Egyptian concept of magic. And then also in this text, it describes how Isis searches for Osiris tirelessly, who goes around the land as a mourner. She did not stop until she found him, Migem to Su, who made shade with her feathers, who created breath by means of her wings, who made a celebration of the mooring. This is the burial, as to moor a ship to go into the west, of her brother. And this idea of the goddess having wings, making shade with her feathers. We looked at these bird images of Isis and Nephthys in the first class. And there are these beautiful images of the winged Isis, literally enclosing or protecting her brother Osiris. Now, the first place I want to begin with a exploration of Isis's ability to wield magic in order to help the universe itself continue to exist is the Valley of the Kings. So this is looking south and one of the first photographs ever taken of the Valley of the Kings. And this is a motif that you will often hear me talk about. So if you've been in my classes before, this slide will look familiar. And if you haven't been in my classes before, this will be a treat of new information. And there is a very common misconception, both in published Egyptological works and in documentaries, that the Valley of the Kings is chosen because the mountain looks like a natural pyramid. And so it continues this tradition of royal tombs and pyramids. Not at all. When the ancient Egyptians looked at this mountain, they did not see a pyramid. They saw a cobra, and they called this peak either Tadahenet, like the forehead or the peak of your head, or they referred to her as Merit Seger, she who loves silence. And while all goddesses could be cobras, including Isis herself, that can take the determinative of a cobra, some goddesses occur almost exclusively in cobra form. Merit Seger, she who loves silence, is one, the goddess that represents the personification of this peak, this mountain in the Western Desert above the Valley of the Kings. Another example would be Ren-Nutet, who is a goddess of the harvest, fertility goddess, but very specifically related to agriculture. And within the Valley of the Kings, we of course have royal tombs. This is one of the most spectacular, the tomb of Seti I. We see Isis here embracing Seti I, and behind is a scene from the Book of Gates. Now, the Book of Gates, as well as the Book of the Hidden Chamber, or commonly known as the Book of Amduat, are part of a set of texts that we call the Netherworld books. A year ago, I did a 3-part class on the Netherworld books, barely scratched the surface of what you could say about them. John and I did a complete English translation of the text in the New Kingdom royal tombs. And so the many more classes to come on the Netherworld books and specific themes. And what I want to focus on is the role of Isis within at least 2 examples of the Netherworld books. And these compositions, such as the Book of Gates and the Book of Amduat, are divided into 12 hours, the 12 hours of the night. And they don't describe exactly the same events. And then there are other texts that aren't divided up by hours, but all of them involve, what does the sun god do when he descends into the western horizon? What is this nightly journey like? Because that nightly journey of the sun provides the template for mankind's own posthumous resurrection. That's the whole reason why you mummify and make all of these funerary offerings. So here in the 5th hour of the night, so getting to be the middle of the night, we have the sun god in his boat. It's no longer a boat, it's actually a serpent, because all the water has been sucked out of this realm, the realm of Ra-Sutau, the place of hauling, where the boat becomes a serpent that slithers over the sand. Oh, one more great question actually about pyramids and mountain. So the pyramid shape seems to reference the mound of creation. So it's not so much a mountain that exists in the world as it is fully formed, but the mound at the very beginning of time. So not so much what we would think of as the mountains to either side of the Nile Valley. Great question, though. And in this 5th hour, we have the bark of the sun, or the serpent boat, being towed over a pyramid-shaped mound. And this is actually a beautiful illustration of the pyramid as mound. This is a sandy mound in the shape of a pyramid with the head of Isis. It's not shown in this drawing, which is just a line drawing of the images, but all of these images are accompanied by hieroglyphs that appear all throughout these registers. And so this is labeled the head of Isis. Above her is a scarab that is actually moving the tow rope that is going over the mountain or the pyramid. And this is a mound/chest with 2 birds. And down below is the egg of Sokar, the serpent egg that is literally the place of recreation. And the caption down below says that a sound is heard in this oval, like the crash of heaven when it storms. So this idea that this like thunderous roar of the recreation of the world is taking place all within this oval. So we're to imagine things moving, fire-breathing serpents. It's really amazing, and so few people read these texts, even Egyptologists, much fewer read them than, say, the Book of the Dead or the Coffin text. And when we look at this sun boat, we can compare it actually to Ra-Horakhti, the falcon-headed sun god, down here in the tomb of Senedjem, that's in an actual boat as opposed to the serpent boat. And within the center of the serpent boat, you see the ram-headed sun god. And that is actually where we're getting the ram head on the mummy of the unified Osiris that we looked at last class. And all throughout this image, we see the BAB scheme. So Sphinx, egg, Sphinx, wing, god, wing, bird, mound, bird. I mean, over and over and over again. And all of these are intended to describe this sort of solar cycle. And the two birds in the mound up above, which is actually labeled a chest. So it looks like a mound of sand, but it's actually a chest for containing probably the body of Osiris. That chest, the birds are labeled Isis and Nephthys. So we not only have the head of Isis on the pyramidal mound below, but we have Isis and Nephthys as birds, just like we saw in the tomb of Senedjem. And the little hieroglyph above the mound is actually the hieroglyph for night, the idea that all of this is taking place during the darkness. And the caption to this says, when this god meaning the sun god, halts at the head of this goddess, Isis here, he issues commands, that's a typo, in the land of Sokar. Sokar is the falcon-headed god of the earth / netherworld down below. He does this daily. It is Khepri within his chest who conducts the tow rope during the hauling over this cavern so that he might occupy the pass of the netherworld. So the head of Isis here guards over the moment of recreation in the 5th hour of the night. And then in the 7th hour of the night, Re has to combat the chaos serpent Apep. Unlike Set, who murders Osiris and has a negative role in certain contexts of ancient Egyptian religion, Set is still potentially good in that he can use his own chaotic powers to fight against Apep. And we were just talking, and here too, this is the tomb of Seti the First. Seti, he of Set. Very clearly, Set is not a god of evil, or a king wouldn't be named after him. Apep, on the other hand, is a true evil force. But even through his evil, even through the attempt to destroy everything, provides the impetus for new creation. So there can even be positive aspects to Apep in that through destruction is recreation. And we see this in a number of texts. But for the most part, you have to defeat Apep so the sun can keep going, so the sun can rise again in the eastern horizon, and that the universe can continue to exist. So here in the 7th hour of the Book of the Hidden Chamber, we see Isis at the prow of the sun's bark. So here is Isis, and she has her arm out, and this sort of address, it's also it's for speech. It can also be for magical incantation. And so she is uttering magic spells. We're going to see this in the caption against Apep, who has knives sticking through his body. He's also being lassoed at both his neck and his tail. And Apep must be overcome in order for the sun god to continue in his journey. And as I mentioned, rise in the eastern horizon of the sky. And so Isis's magical spells become essential for the maintenance of the cosmos. People on leashes. Now I'm curious. Yes, so those are bound enemies. Bound enemies being uh, all in the lassos are all in the ropes are all in the hands of this god. I forget what his specific name is. They're all labeled. And we actually do see this even in temple walls where all the enemies and the names of the enemy towns all the ropes go into the hand of, say, victorious thieves or the king. And we do have decapitated enemies. Those are the enemies of Osiris. And then moving a little bit further over to the left, the snake here, that's a positive snake. That's the snake Mehen, who is protecting Osiris just as Mehen protects the sun god. Like I said, we're going to have to do a lot more classes on the Netherworld books because this is something that a lot of my research is focused on, and it's pretty exciting to bring kind of cutting edge scholarship to people everywhere. So the majesty of this great god, that's the sun god, is in the grotto of Osiris. He issues commands and takes on another visible form at this grotto, again, grotto, cavern. We have to come up with synonyms for all these different hours of the night, so that he might deflect the path from Apep by means of the magic of Isis and the elder magician. It is specifically Isis's magical power, along with the magic of a god that's actually called Hekau Semsu, great magic or elder magic, that enables the sun god to continue in his journey. And all of this magic, all of this knowledge is not only effective in the sky, in the heavens, and in the earth, in the underworld, but also on earth. And we will see that increasingly the magic of Isis gets applied to day-to-day scenarios and is increasingly applied for people in their own lives. And one of the first places we see this is in a New Kingdom story called Isis and the Secret Name of Re. This is the story that I told you last week, where Re, who is quite old, drools a little bit. I need not to laugh. And Isis collects some of that drool, mixes it with clay, creates a serpent. The serpent then bites Re, and because the serpent contains some of Re's own matter, he cannot heal himself of this poison. And so Isis volunteers to heal him because she is the greatest magician among the gods. But in order to heal Re, she needs to have his secret name. He tries not to give it to her, but in the end, he does. And that then gives Isis the power to heal Re and ultimately all people. And I see some additional questions in the chat. I'll get to those right at the end. So the conclusion of the tale of Isis and the secret name of Re, all of this is embedded within a magical incantation. We don't just have it as a separate literary text. We actually have it as an explanation of where the power of the spell is coming from. I'm going to mute and turn off the video for just a moment, and you can read the translation here. Okay, so in this text, which is intended to drive out the poison of scorpions, the venom of scorpions, it says, leave scorpions, go out from Re. Behold, the great god Re has revealed his name. Re will live, the poison has died. The person for whom the magical spells is recited, so you'd actually write the person's name there, will live, and the poison has died. Thus, Isis the Great One has spoken, she who knows Re's own name. And you're supposed to recite all of these words over an image of Atum, Horus the Praised One, and an image of Osiris, of Isis and Horus. It's actually drawn on your hand. And then you're supposed to lick it off. And this seems weird, but actually in an Egyptian context, it makes more sense because to swallow and to understand, to know something, is the same verb. So that by licking the image off your hand, you're imbibing the knowledge, the power of the spell. They also add some ground herbs because they're not going to keep this totally in the realm of magic, and that this is an effective way to kill a poison proven a million times. So this whole story of the magic of Isis becomes applied to personal magical and medical practice. And we will see this become increasingly the case that Isis, as the one great of magic, not only saves Re from Apep, but can be a personal savior goddess as well. And one final element as we transition into the Greco-Roman world, so really beginning with the Hellenistic age, and for that, we can look to the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. He invades Egypt in 332 BCE, and basically the 3 centuries between the death of Alexander the Great and the death of Cleopatra are considered to be the Ptolemaic era in Egypt. Then Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire. So as a shorthand, I'm going to say Greco-Roman. Hellenistic culturally is probably a slightly more accurate term, but I'll stick with Greco-Roman because we'll also be talking about some Roman material. So as a setup for Greco-Roman mythological accounts of Osiris, I'm going to show you one more example of Isis in an unusual guise. This is Isis in her manifestation of the goddess of the West, Imanet. And the falcon on this little perch actually writes the word West in ancient Egyptian. And this is indeed Isis, as we know from the caption. And there are other cases where Isis has this perch and a feather. Sometimes the feather and the falcon is there. And this is because Isis can personify the underworld. And for the Egyptians, the term West, not just as a direction, but as a location, West is the underworld. And both the word West, the noun, and the word Duat for underworld are grammatically feminine. So they can be personified through goddesses. And here we have a perfect example where this is very clearly Isis, even though she's labeled as West. They are synonymous here, protecting Osiris. So that's a variant along with the cow horns and sun disk and the throne. And here Isis says, welcome, welcome in peace. I unite with you. I embrace you with my arms. I lead life to all, probably your limbs, as I indeed exist as the protection of your body. My arms will encircle you forever and ever. And the you here is both her brother Osiris and the deceased person. This is in the tomb of Amenemhat. And she is then embracing Amenemhat, who has become an Osiris, just like we saw Queen Nefertari becomes an Osiris. And this idea of Isis as well as Nephthys and 2 other goddesses, Neat and Selkat, who's asleep at the moment, but that is the goddess she's named after. They are 4 goddesses that can protect the canopic jars, that can protect the containers with the internal organs, and they thus literally exist as the protection for the body of the deceased, not only on coffins, but also on these separate canopic chests. And I wanted to bring up canopic jars because this shows a really interesting history of terminology in our study of ancient Egypt. So canopic jars, typically there are 4 of them, not 5. And when you see them in the New Kingdom and later, they almost always have 4 different heads. We have Kabah-Senuath, who is the falcon. We have Imseti, who is human-headed. We have Hapi, who is the baboon, and Duamutef, who is the jackal. I think if I had to pick one, I'd pick Duamutef because I think that jackal is really cute. He often is. In earlier canopic jars, very often you just have 4 human heads, even though each of the gods' names are still written. And I particularly like this example from the Middle Kingdom because it looks like a little mummy mask that is put on the canopic jar. Now, the term canopic jar is not what the ancient Egyptians called them. In fact, we get the term canopic jar because of a water jar with the head of Osiris that was important to the worship of Osiris in the western delta city of Canopus or Canopus. And so Osiris, Osiris Serapis, is worshipped as this human-headed jar that contains water. And that is why when early people, like 17, 1800s, were looking at these jars, even though they knew, in fact, as early as medieval Arabic writers, they knew these things contained human organs. But the term canopic jar stuck in the European world because of this connection in Greco-Roman sources with Osiris Canopus, because you can see it really does look like our conception of what we call a canopic jar, although it's used for a totally different reason. So when we say canopic jar, that bears no connection to the terminology of the ancient Egyptians and instead references this water jar. And I love this example, which is actually from Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. And this was almost certainly carved in Italy rather than Egypt. And you can see the Apis bull, winged sun disk, a scarab, Horus the child. So all of these great Egyptian images. And Canopus was actually one of the places that Hadrian tried to recreate in his villa at Tivoli. So great example of Roman Egyptomania. And underwater archaeology in the past couple of decades has really revealed amazing things about ancient Canopus, which is now under the water just because of the shifting coastline. Now, let's get to the description of the myth of Osiris as it exists in Plutarch's Osiris and Isis, which was written in the early 2nd century CE, say about 125. And then what I want to do is kind of go through which of these aspects of the story seem to make sense as evidence of possibly parts of the ancient Egyptian earlier myth that simply are not fully fleshed out in the original sources, and how many of these aspects are probably later interpolations, because Plutarch is not simply trying to record what the ancient Egyptians themselves believed, but the context of the worship of Isis and Osiris in Egypt, as well as the spread of those cults, Isis in particular, throughout the Mediterranean world. So it begins where Osiris is born on the first of the extra days at the end of the year. And Hermes slash Thoth gets those extra days by playing draughts with the moon, playing a board game against the moon. And it's interesting because in ancient Egypt, obviously Thoth is the god of the moon, one of the gods of the moon, and he is the god that creates calendars and timekeeping. So he doesn't have to play a board game in order to get the extra days. He can just calculate them. But this idea that you have to create 5 extra days at the end of the year is something that goes back to ancient Egypt. So Osiris is born on the first day, Isis on the 4th day, Set as well on the 3rd day, I believe, 2nd or 3rd day. Osiris rules as king of the Egyptians, invents agriculture, creates law. He would later civilize the whole world thus, is what Plutarch tells us. And one particularly prominent person in Italy, although he is Spanish, not Italian, Pope Alexander VI, commonly known as the Borgia Pope, because that was his family name, will use this myth of Isis and Osiris and Apis, as it was preserved in Greco-Roman texts like Plutarch, as the decoration on the ceiling of his apartments in the Vatican. Probably the last place you think you'd look for an ancient Egyptian god. Now, Set Typhon, that's the name they use in the Greek, plots against his brother. And so he has this elaborate plan where he makes a decorated chest according to Osiris's measurements. And he brings this really fancy chest to a party with the gods. And he says, well, whoever fits in the chest gets to keep it. So everybody lays down, see if it fits them. And of course, Osiris tries it out. And it fits him perfectly. Typhon then jumps up, Set jumps up, nails the lid shut, throws the chest into the water. And Plutarch has this fascinating extra little detail, how the Pans and the Satyrs of the Delta are the first to know. And so anytime you act in this confused, irrational way, that is to panic, so literally to act like Pan. He gives us these fun little tangents. The chest with the body of Osiris ends up at Byblos. A tree grows around it. Various things happen. Isis goes to Byblos, befriends the queen. Isis even turns into a swallow who gives forth these wailing cries. At night, she also tries to burn away the mortality of the Byblos queen's child by putting the child in a fire, which is obviously not going to burn the child because it's Isis doing it. But this causes predictable concern among the mother. Isis then brings the chest back to the Delta of Egypt, where Horus is being raised. And we know from ancient Egyptian accounts that Horus is raised in the Delta. He is protected in the Delta marshes from Set. Typhon realizes Osiris's body is back in Egypt, so he cuts Osiris's body into 14 pieces. Sorry, and scatters them. Each one becomes a tomb of Osiris. And we know by the first millennium BCE in Egypt that there were at least 14 places in Egypt that had the so-called relics of Osiris. One might have a thigh, one might have an arm, one might have the head. And these were places that were particularly significant to the worship of Osiris. And at the very end of the story, Horus avenges the murder of his father by fighting with Set. And this is something we see both in ancient Egyptian religious texts. Horus is very commonly called he who avenges his father, Nej-Itaf. And we see it even in literature in the so-called contendings of Horus and Set, where you have all these battles. Where at one point, even when Horus and Set are both hippopotami and attacking one another, Isis throws a harpoon into the water and hits Horus rather than Set. And Horus gets so angry that he knocks off Isis's head and replaces it with a cow. So they're very satirical in terms of the way we conceptualize ancient Egyptian approaches to the gods. But in its basic outline, although not in all of its specific, Plutarch's account does seem to be based on a lot of the original ancient Egyptian sources, such as this idea of Isis searching for Osiris tirelessly, either in Byblos, according to Plutarch, or in those different places in Egypt when Set cuts up the body, depending on how you see the sequence of events. In magical texts, then, in addition to the funerary significance of Isis, we have statements such as on the Metternich stela, which is just who bought it. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where Isis says, I am Isis, the goddess, lord of magic. This is Hekon, who performs magic, effective of speech, efficacious of words. And by the end of the New Kingdom, the healing and magical powers of Isis increasingly extended beyond the funerary realm. She becomes a cosmic goddess, the epitome of the divine feminine in the ancient Mediterranean. And where I think a lot of this comes from, whence this comes, is the association of Isis with the goddess Hathor, with the solar cycle, particularly the beginning of the new year. So the new year in ancient Egypt was the beginning of the inundation season, the rising of the floodwaters. end of July, early August. And astronomically, this was marked by the heliacal rising of Sothis. This is the dog star Sirius in ancient Egyptian Septet. And so there are a whole constellation of goddesses, Hathor, Sahmet, Bastet, Shemitat, that all become part of this annual cycle. And by the Ptolemaic period, for certain, and we see intimations of this earlier, Isis subsumes into her own theology the cosmic goddess Hathor. Hathor, as we know from these columns at Dendra Temple, those columns have four faces. Hathor is called the four-faced goddess, just as Re in his cosmic form has four heads. This idea of a face for each of the cardinal directions. This is not simply a goddess with a confined role, but a goddess who can represent the entire universe, who has control over the workings of the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, just like her father Re. And while the ancient Egyptians would most commonly give the name Hathor to that goddess earlier on, by the time of the Ptolemies, Cleopatra VII in particular, because that's at the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the name given to that goddess would be Isis. Here we have Cleopatra VII, who dies in 30 BCE. Her son Caesarion, literally Little Caesar, and she's in front of the goddess Isis, who has the cow horns and sun disk of Hathor, but also the little throne on top. And this is otherwise at the Temple of Dendera, which is a temple dedicated to Hathor. But Hathor and Isis are two names for the same goddess at this point in time. It's also interesting that Cleopatra VII in particular would choose to associate herself very closely with the worship of Isis and identify herself as Isis. She's even said to dress up like Isis when she meets Mark Antony at Tarsus. And this makes sense in terms of political theology because the father of her son, Julius Caesar, is dead. He is murdered on the Ides of March 44 BCE. Now, Isis, the father of her son Horus, is Osiris, ruler of the underworld. So it fits rather well if Cleopatra VII is associating herself on the throne with her young son Caesarion to cast herself in the role of Isis because Julius Caesar is also deceased. It really aligns sort of her political needs because the Ptolemies, particularly the population in Alexandria, do not like women ruling alone. And it fits so perfectly with associating the queens with the goddess Isis, which we know happened even before Cleopatra. This is a statue likely of Cleopatra VII. It's hard to say because this cartouche is probably not original, but this knotted fabric and the braided locks specifically associate this Ptolemaic queen. Like I said, probably Cleopatra VII, but this happens with several other Ptolemaic queens as well, to associate them with the goddess Isis. And so that knotted fabric in particular is iconographic for, is symbolic of Isis. I'm going to let you read this for just a second. I have to top off my water. I'm going to mute and turn off my video for a moment, and I will be right back. Okay, so all of this also makes sense for Cleopatra because and for other Ptolemaic queens, because Isis cares for the living king just as she cares for Horus. Horus is the template for earthly kingship. So here at the temple of Seti the First at Abydos, we have Isis here caring for Seti the First. She's not exactly nursing him in this particular scene, although we do have scenes of the goddess nursing the king well before the Ptolemaic period. But she's sort of touching him fondly under the chin. And we know this is something adults, parents do to children, like kind of tickle them under the chin. We have a big discussion of that actually in Egypt's Golden Couple, because it's significant for understanding what happens after the reign of Akhenaten in this totally bizarre way. And then later on, particularly, we have these really, really common statuettes of Isis nursing Horus. And we can call this Isis lactans, Isis nursing, giving forth milk. And these images continue through the 4th, even early 5th century CE. And you will often see, and I actually thought that this was much more um, attested in the original source material, that uh, Isis nursing Horus is what gives us the imagery of a Mary nursing Jesus. But there seems to be a couple century gap. And what I would say, just to comment on sort of the interaction between earlier Egyptian symbols and then imagery in Christianity, is that a woman nursing her son is something that you could hit upon in many different cultures. So was there a little bit of influence from Isis? Possibly. But where we can be much more certain that there's a connection is in epithets and descriptions of Isis, where very specific titles, such as Star of the Sea, Stella Maris, exist for Isis as the star that sailors can use to navigate. She's the protector of sailors at sea. And then this is incorporated into hymns to the Virgin Mary. So there, I think we can draw some definite connections. Artistically, I'm not totally convinced that scenes of Mary and the Jesus, and Jesus as a child suckling, is directly taken from ancient Egypt, but it is a possibility. Now, one of the reasons why we can even talk about this possible connection is that the worship of Isis extends far beyond Egypt in the Greco-Roman world. And when Isis is exported, the Ptolemaic dynasty also attempts to both create in Egypt and to export the worship of a god named Serapis, which comes from Osiris Apis, so Apis being the divine bull, actually of Ptah. And when Serapis is depicted as a deity, he has this very long, luxurious hair and beard, typically a grain measure on his head, and dressed in Greek style, not in ancient Egyptian clothes. And while Isis takes off and is worshipped everywhere, worshipped in cities from London to Persia, Serapis not so much. He never becomes as popular as Isis, probably because to a certain extent, he is a manufactured deity, where the Ptolemies are trying to take aspects of, say, Greek Zeus and incorporate them with Osiris. And it just doesn't work on a visceral level the way Isis does. But we very often see sets of jewelry and art where we have both Isis and Serapis. So it's good to know who Serapis is and his iconography, but he theologically just pales in comparison to Isis. Now, there are temples to Isis throughout the Mediterranean. One of the earliest that has survived quite well is on the island of Delos. And this isn't even the earliest one on Delos, from about 150 BCE. And what's interesting is that Delos here, you can see one of the islands, so not too far from Athens, and Crete is here, Turkey here. Asia Minor, when we're talking about antiquity. Delos has a river that they compared to the Nile and even had this idea that the Nile floodwaters would go underneath the Mediterranean and come up on the island of Delos, so that there was this physical connection between Delos and Egypt, as well as the theological connection of the worship of Isis. The same is true of Isis temples in Rome and the Tiber. So wherever there is a river, Isis worship works because it can be associated with the Nile. Now, the most famous of the Roman sites of Isis worship are Pompeii and Herculaneum, both of which were destroyed. I said this in the afternoon too, not destroyed. They were, well, for human habitation, they were destroyed by either ash or mudslides in the case of Pompeii and Herculaneum. But it really preserved, as we know, the archaeological evidence to just a phenomenal degree, to the point that we can look at the seeds in a garden and say the plants that were in this garden and houses that are preserved a couple stories high. And we have phenomenal amounts of art and architecture. So from Herculaneum, we have this beautiful fresco of an Isis temple. The chief priest holding a jar of water, likely water from the inundation. Priests also wearing linen and shaved heads, holding sistra. You have ibises walking around. These ibises could have very well been, I mean, I think they probably really were there. They probably got a little bit chilly, but they would have brought ibises over. You have the main altar to Isis. Various people, how many of them would have been actually initiates into the mystery religion of Isis? Similar to the mystery religion of Dionysus in the Greco-Roman world, or Mithras, for example. We don't know whether all of these people had this deeper connection to the cult, or simply were residents participating in this ritual. And the sphinxes as well. Nothing says Egypt quite like a sphinx. So we can tell that these rituals were taking place. And what's interesting is in the description of Plutarch, he talks about how just shaving your head and wearing linen doesn't make you a worshiper of Isis. It's about true beliefs. It's about studying the truth contained within the religious doctrine and performing the ceremonies. And so when we look at this painting, this fresco, to think about that this is not simply an exotic representation of another land or another religion, but that the people participating in this ceremony would have really understood the connections in the religion of Isis and the extent to which that derived from ancient Egyptian material, in addition to these extra Hellenistic elements. Like I said, the mystery religion side of things that also had some parallels with other Greco-Roman mystery religions. And Plutarch is also fun if you read the translation, because he has all kinds of bizarre material, not just things that are directly parallel in ancient Egyptian texts, but things that kind of come out of nowhere. Just to give you one example, because I thought those was hilarious, that the Apis bull does not drink from the Nile because the water of the river is reputed to be fattening. So he has to have his own well. So he doesn't put on weight by drinking Nile water, which is just hilarious. So mix of profound connections with ancient Egyptian religion and really bizarre statements. And of course, the sistrum, which we see here in the hands of the priest, not the high priest, but one of the priests, is an instrument that we see in ancient Egyptian rituals. It is still used in the Christian church in Ethiopia. And this example is missing the discs that would have actually created the sound by hitting one another as you shook the sistrum. So in its details, we can really see an appreciation of ancient Egyptian imagery, and even the battered sides of the doorway here, probably a pylon-shaped entrance. And this painting seems to be from a house actually, rather than a temple. And there are a number of scenes of Nilotic life incorporated into Roman domestic context. And one of the articles that I sent in the suggested reading list by Caitlin Barrett talks about Egyptian paintings in Roman domestic context. I think is a really nice additional supplementary material to what I've been talking about here. And to bring us then to the end of how Isis becomes so popular in the Greco-Roman world. And we can see this through the perspective of a set of texts that are called oratologies, speeches given by the goddess, as well as hymns directly to Isis. So in one, she actually takes credit for inventing hieroglyphs and demotic along with Thoth / Hermes. And Diodorus Siculus, here between 60 and 30 BCE, has Isis saying, I am Isis, the queen of every land, not just Egypt. She who was instructed of Hermes, so has all the learning of Thoth. This is where Hermeticism and Isis come together. She's wife and sister of King Osiris, and she who riseth in the star that is in the constellation of the dog. That is the star Sirius. That is the star that signals the beginning of the new year for the ancient Egyptians. This is Isis taking that cosmic role of Hathor. This is how she becomes the queen of every land. And that's a detail that if you didn't know the Egyptian material, wouldn't really make sense. What does it mean that she's a star in the constellation of the dog? But for Egypt, that's huge. That is everything in terms of the mythology of the goddess of the eye of the sun. And we even see in Greco-Roman imagery, Isis being related to Isis Aphrodite in various different ways. And she can even be called the one who is all, quite reminiscent, in fact, a direct parallel with what we saw in the Hermeticism class with the emerald tablet, the microcosm and the macrocosm, and this idea of Hermes Trismegistos, incorporating all three aspects, like everything in the world, what is below on earth and above. So this universalizing of Isis fits really well with how we see the development of her theology within Egypt itself. And this is an excerpt from a hymn to Isis that's carved in a temple in the Fayum. And this idea that all mortals who live on earth talk about Isis, they give her names, Astarte and Artemis, Aphrodite, Demeter, but all of them are worshiping the same goddess. And her greatest name, the mightiest, is Isis. She is Isis, even though she is called something different by each individual people on earth. And this is Isis truly as the goddess who encompasses all. And there are a number of these hymns that really that repeat the same sentiment. And we even see it in literature, particularly Apuleius's Metamorphoses, given the much less flattering name, The Golden Ass, by Augustine of Hippo, composed in the 2nd century CE. This is the only Roman novel actually to survive intact. And the main character, Lucius, goes through all these various complicated things. But the basic outline of the story is that he attempts to practice magic, messes up the spell, turns himself into a donkey, and after having many adventures and many tangential tales, he witnesses a procession of Isis, the queen of heaven, who saves him from his asinine state. I just had to use the secondary definition of asinine. And he's turned back into a human by eating a crown of roses held by one of the priestesses. And so in Roman cartonnage, this is from about 225 CE, there's often a cup holding either water or wine relating to Osiris and Dionysus, and some sort of floral element, like the roses that Lucius must eat in order to be transformed from a donkey back into a human. Now, the very final worshipers of Isis, the last people in the living tradition of Isis worship that began all the way in the Old Kingdom of Egypt and continues up until the conversion of most of the ancient Mediterranean world to Christianity, those final worshipers of Isis are Nubians to the south. And the last datable hieroglyphic inscription at Philae Temple. So it's the last datable hieroglyphic inscription in Egypt. It happens to be at Philae Temple in the first cataract in Aswan. Here are very early photos. This one, 1844, same day as our house, actually. It's a daguerreotype. That hieroglyphic inscription was written by the son of a priest of Isis. And he was almost certainly at Philae in order to participate in some of these Isis festivities, even though the temple was no longer fully functioning. And sometimes the statue would even be taken from Philae, from Aswan, into Nubia and then returned. And it wasn't until the reign of Theodosius that the temples were finally closed and sort of this continuous tradition of Isis worship finally ended. But if you look at Nubian religion, particularly of the later periods, when Isis becomes more important in Egypt as well, in Meroitic iconography, you very often see Anubis and Isis, and here they're actually pouring a libation of milk. So the worship of Isis can take us all throughout the Roman Empire and take us further south into Nubia. It really is a window at looking at the influence of ancient Egypt on the world. And with this, I would like to end with that most unlikely seeming place for the inclusion of the mythology of Isis and Osiris and the Apis. So here we just have Horemheb in front of Isis. This is our traditional ancient Egyptian imagery. But this is an Apis bowl. We have Isis and Osiris as well. This is the ceiling of the Borgia apartments in the Vatican, 1493 CE, painted by Pinturicchio. And the Pope did not believe that these were gods, but he did believe that they were great people in history from whom he was descended. So Isis even makes it into the Vatican, and by appreciating the complexity of her theology, how we are to understand the very nature of divinity in ancient Egypt, and how this very specific manifestation of Isis can teach us so much about the continued influence of ancient Egypt all around the world. Thank you so much for participating in this class. It has been an honor to start the new year with all of you. There will be a 2-month break in classes because I will be in Egypt. And then I will return mid-March. And before then, I will be announcing a whole lineup of classes for 2024, both hieroglyphs and lecture courses. And the lecture courses will always be on Tuesdays. But before I stop the recording, let me open up the chat. And there were a couple of questions I wanted to make sure that I cover. Oh, and Clara and Lily mentioned bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream. That's where Shakespeare gets it. Shakespeare bases bottom on Lucius in the Metamorphoses. Okay. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to stop the screen share for a moment. Yes, just because when I'm only looking at myself and answering questions in the chat, it just feels very, very isolating. Is the elder magician related to Thoth? In this particular case, he is not. So Thoth is also a god who is magically potent because of his control over time and hieroglyphs. But in that particular passage in the 7th hour of the Book of the Hidden Chamber, he doesn't have any direct connection with Thoth. Established in the double throne in the double horizon. Let me look at that passage really quickly. Oh, no, I'm not seeing that. Okay, the double throne one, that I'll have to get back to you because I didn't see that in the translation. But in case everyone's wondering about the book, I know I've shown this before a lot. And we get absolutely no royalties because it's an academic book. So I know it's kind of expensive, but it's also 800 pages long. This is the Ancient Egyptian Netherworld books. So all the translations are in there. What is the secret name of Re? We never learn. That's not the sort of thing that the ancient Egyptians would actually reveal. So the whole point is it's used in the context of the magic spell, but they're not going to write it down. And when they do write down things that are that magically powerful, they tend to use cryptography. They tend to use enigmatic writing so that only the people who are properly initiated can read it. And it's funny, the actual name of the jars, of the canopic jars, I'm going to have to look that up. As I was mentioning it, I was like, it's not canopic jar. That's not what the ancient Egyptians call it. But now I can't off the top of my head think of what they call a canopic jar. I can think of what they call coffins, because they have a number of different terms for coffin. But canopic jar, I will have to look up. When Joe asks, was Caesarion then associated with Horus? Yes, he was, because he rules as Ptolemy the 14th. So he actually becomes the living Horus. So all kings have even a Horus name. So absolutely, because Cleopatra is ruling as a co-regent, even though Caesarion's a child, like very clearly he's not doing anything other than getting dressed up by his mother and like parading around the palace. But yeah, he would have been associated with Horus. Oh, Tara asks, do the priests and priestesses of Isis always have shaven heads? It seems to mostly be the priests who shave their heads. And we actually have that for priests of all gods in Egypt, that just priestly service often came with the requirement to shave your head, and apparently body hair as well. And we have there's just these hundreds examples of metal razors and tweezers. So they seem to be very concerned with hair removal, and they had lots of tools if you wanted to do that. Oh, do I have a replica sistrum? I do not. I should get one. I think I saw a pretty good one on Etsy one time, actually, but I haven't looked back at that. Oh, that's fascinating. The River Thames is known as Isis when it goes through Oxford. Oh, great fact, Deb. That is so much fun. Snake catching staff on his toe. Oh, I think that's just because the two figures are overlapping. um, Okay, well, thank you for all your really kind comments. Oh, one additional question about why did they shave their heads? It was a sense of purity. And it probably also prevented lice, and it just gave this really uniform appearance to all the priests. So it seems to have been both practical and signaling this religious status. And since the ancient Egyptians wore wigs so much, even though you were shaving your hair, you could still put on any number of hairstyles because you had wigs as as an option. So I'll answer a few more of the questions, but just because I don't want to keep everyone too late, and I need to save my voice for my 3 classes tomorrow. But yes, I'm going to stop the recording. I'll stick around for like 3 more minutes, but thank you all so much. It was such a pleasure, and I will definitely catch you guys back here in mid-March.
Thank
Bye.
you.